Cool. Well, Aaron, thanks again for joining us and jumping on again. I know we've got a lot to talk about. I think, where a lot of this conversation is going to be around this time is going to be the things you're doing with Take Back the Court. So if you could maybe start by giving everybody some perspective on what Take Back the Court is and some of the work and focus that you guys are doing.
Yeah, Take Back the Court is, you can think of it as a project or a campaign or an institute. And its mission is to underscore the urgency of Supreme Court expansion as a necessary step for restoring democracy.
Cool. So could you maybe give us some context? I know Nick and I have a few notes here because there's a lot of details to keep track of. I mean, especially for us, we're not nearly as immersed in this as you are, but um, some of the key points and like the priorities that make Take Back the Court and like you said, restoring democracy. Like where's the focus being put as far as making that a reality?
I don't understand where's the focus being put to make that a reality. In other words, what are the strategies or what's the rationale or what, like, which part are you asking about?
Actually, why don't we do both? What's the rationale, and then what strategies to um, are you employing? Yeah.
Yeah. So the rationale is that three things have come together um, for the first time in American history, and we've had elements of all three of these things in the past, but this is the first time when they all have converged at a point in time. And the first is that arguably the Supreme Court was stolen in 2016 when a vacancy opened after the late Justice Scalia died. And Mitch McConnell would not allow President Obama to fill that vacancy, which is the first time that's happened in modern American history. The court had already been, I mean, it had delivered a few progressive rulings, especially in gay rights, but the data show that the court was already an extremely conservative court for the past generation. And so that vacancy would have flipped the court from an arch conservative court to a more progressive court. But not only did Mitch McConnell steal the seat, but even ostensibly moderate Republican leaders like the late John McCain said that if Hillary Clinton were to win the 2016 election, but the Republicans held the Senate, they would simply freeze the size of the court at 8 until a Republican won the White House again. So in other words, they weren't going to give up that seat no matter what. So the first issue is that the court was arguably stolen, although, some people don't like that word stolen, but it's pretty much what happened. And the reason it was stolen is because the court is part of Mitch McConnell's formula for winning elections, which gets us to the second problem and the second rationale for Take Back the Court, which is the court has implicated itself in the sabotaging of democracy on behalf of the GOP. And so the court shattered the Voting Rights Act, has been shattering campaign finance limitations, not just in Citizens United, but going back a generation. The court later would bless hyperpartisan gerrymandering. And all of these moves are made for a reason, which is that they enable Republicans to win elections in a country in which Republican ideas are becoming less and less popular. And so they rely on, I'll use the word cheating, which is what I think voter suppression is, but more polite people say constitutional hardball. But the Republicans have to cheat in order to win, and the court enables that. So that's the second thing. And the third thing that came together is that the court, at least when I started Take Back the Court 2.5 years ago, seemed very unlikely to allow future administrations to address the crises we face as a nation. So not just democracy crises like voter suppression, which are in that kind of second pillar of the rationale, but here I have in mind more kind of policy crises like climate change and gun violence. And like, how could I be so sure about that? Well, when you look at the data, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island did a study of every single split decision civil case under Justice Roberts, in which Republican donors had a clear and major interest. So what's a split decision civil case? Civil case, non-criminal case, and a split decision case is a 5-4 or a 5-3 decision. That when the court splits 5-4 or 5-3, that means it's a pretty almost certainly a pretty high stakes and or ideologically charged case. And so at the time he did his study a couple of years ago, there had been 73 split decision civil cases under Justice Roberts going back to 2005. The court had voted in the direction favored by Republican donors 73 times. So 73 out of 73. So 100% of the time. And these were cases that involved, climate, corporations, racial justice, women's rights, and just all kinds of stuff. The range of things the court decides. It is clearly not a court that, and I'll say this, interestingly, in about half of those 73 cases, Senator Whitehouse showed the conservative justices sidestepped or undermined or ignored conservative judicial doctrine like originalism or textualism or stare decisis. The kind of substance of those doctrines don't matter, but what that pattern shows is the conservative justices are politicians in robes. I don't think they give a shit about law or fairness or conservative doctrine. They care about GOP partisan power, about corporate power, about white supremacy. And that's it. And that's what their voting record shows. Evidence be damned, or law be damned, or even their own doctrine be damned. And so with those three things coming together, a stolen court, and, as a political science professor, I know that democracies don't work when courts are stolen. So that in and of itself was bad and had to be responded to. So a stolen court, a court that has been sabotaging democracy, and a court that is unwilling to allow administrations to address planetary emergencies like climate. Something had to be done. And there is a clear solution to the problem, which is called court expansion. Other people call it court packing. But the problem back in 2018, when I started the project, was that idea had been taboo for 81 years, since 1937. And so the idea of Take Back the Court was to get the issue on the map. So that's kind of the underlying rationale behind the campaign. But then like, what would the payoff be? Like, so what, who cares about getting the idea on the map? Well, there are a couple things that we were trying to do, and it's worked so far. One is just by making, if we could end up making a credible threat, not just like one dinky project, but getting powerful groups and leaders to endorse court expansion, just by making that threat, we thought we could move the Overton window, or open the Overton window. In other words, open up a space for a more robust conversation of other reforms short of expansion. And that's worked, because when journalists ask Democratic politicians about court expansion and they don't want to endorse expansion, they have to say something. And so they'll revert, like Bernie Sanders will say, no, I don't support expansion, but I support term limits. Well, we didn't have support for term limits before we pushed court expansion onto the map, or we didn't have it, at least in a robust way. And so the first point of fighting the fight is to open up a space for reforms short of expansion. The second kind of payoff, aim, whatever, is to try to moderate the court. And the notion is that to the extent that Democrats could make a credible threat to expand the court, that might encourage the court to moderate its behavior, to take some of the wind out of the sails of the judicial reform movement. And if we could, even encourage the court to moderate itself in one decision, that could help millions of people. And sure enough, as our work took off over the last two and a half years, we had a term last year where the court issued 4 non-terrible decisions in trans rights, DACA, reproductive justice, and gun safety. Some of the decisions, they weren't great. They were, at best provisional wins, but they at least were not terrible losses. And even conservative court experts speculated that a big part of the reason why the court appeared to moderate itself on those decisions was the robustness of the court expansion threat. that we engineered. So that's that's a very, very important thing. I mean, just on reproductive justice, for example, Roberts at his 2005 confirmation hearings, I'll use the word lied, and said that he thought that Roe v. Wade was settled law. And then over the next 15 years, every single time he had an abortion case in front of him, 6 times, he voted to dismantle Roe v. Wade until last year when we finally got a non-terrible reproductive justice ruling out of Roberts. And so folks think that our strategy worked in partially moderating the court. And then the third idea is that by pushing, if we could push really hard and get a little luck, we actually might end up getting a court expansion bill. And sure enough, I believe there will be movement in Congress soon. It doesn't mean a court expansion bill will pass tomorrow, but if you don't have the conversation first, you're never going to get the bill. Now that we're having the conversation, there's at least a chance that the reform could take place, and that would mean everything for the Biden White House. So that's the rationale.